Madagascar has just marked 66 years of independence. But what does that anniversary mean for a country in the grip of a military transition, suspended from the African Union, and still counting the cost of a Gen Z uprising that forced a president to flee? Today, we look at Madagascar 66 years on through the eyes of one of its most fearless human rights defenders. Her name means little princess in the Malagasy language, but Dr. Ketakandriana Rafitoson is anything but. Rather, she's been a warrior. She topped her country's national judiciary exam and then walked away from the bench, the first trainee judge in Madagascar's history ever to resign. She did this because she was unable to make peace with what she found on the inside. And what has followed has been a lifetime of fighting back, founding a citizens movement, writing a guide to non-violent resistance in her own language, and also blowing the whistle on corruption in Madagascar's lychee trade. And this came at considerable personal cost. She continues to defend human rights and fight corruption. She sits now on the board of Transparency International globally. And in her country, they simply call her Ke. I caught up with her soon after her country's Independence Day, and I began by asking her what independence meant for her now.
When I hear our national anthem, it makes me emotional, usually. I always feel a mixture of pride and responsibility. Pride because independence represented the hope that Malagasy people would finally shape their own destiny. But also, I would say a bit of sadness because for many citizens today, independence has yet to translate into dignity, opportunity, or trust in public institutions. And for too many Malagasy families, daily life is still defined by poverty, power cuts, water shortages, lack of functional basic public services, and a lot of uncertainty, may it be food insecurity, physical insecurity, etc. And political independence was achieved long time ago, 60 years ago in 1960. The challenge, I think, now is really achieving institutional independence. That's what lacking. Building a state that truly serves the common good rather than private interests. Because independence is not just a date on the calendar, it's something we must continue to build every day, to struggle for every day.
Your country ranks 140th out of 180 on the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and close to 80% of Malagasy are living in poverty. In plain terms, what went wrong, do you think?
84% of our population live in extreme poverty today, making Madagascar the fifth poorest country in the world. And it's a shame. This country, I think, is not poor because it lacks resources. It has everything you need, land, population, resources, everything. We are incredibly rich in biodiversity, minerals, and human talent. But our problem is that we have never fully succeeded in building institutions capable of transforming that wealth into shared prosperity. Over the decades, political power became increasingly personalized, public institutions weakened, and corruption evolved from isolated acts into a system of governance. And when institutions no longer protect the public interest, investment declines, public services deteriorate, inequality deepens, and poverty becomes entrenched. So I think our greatest deficit nowadays is institutional governance.
October 2025, the Gen Z uprising saw young people taking to the streets over power cuts and water shortages. And that ended with President Rajoelina fleeing the country and the military stepping in. 8 months on,
Mhm.
what's your assessment of where Madagascar's democratic transition actually stands?
Back to last year, the protests began over electricity and water. But I have to highlight as well that they quickly became about something much deeper, reclaiming dignity, accountability, and the relationship between citizens and the state. The transition, I think, has created an important opportunity, but opportunities are not guarantees. There's a nuance which makes a lot of difference. The authorities have committed to national consultations, constitutional reform, and elections. Those commitments must now translate into an inclusive, transparent, and credible process, including with the young protesters that we had, the Gen Z, because ultimately this transition will be judged not by the promises that are made, but by whether it genuinely strengthens democratic institutions and restores citizens' trust or not. So we started with high hopes, but this hope is declining day by day because we have the feeling that some misfunctions, if you want, are not changing. We have changed the actors, but not the system. So it is quite problematic, I would say.
The Transitional Authority has promised nationwide consultations, a new constitution, and
Mhm.
elections by September 2027. Sadly, we've seen in other countries after military rulers have stepped in, they make all sorts of promises, but some of them start to move the goalposts. Is there a fear that this might happen in Madagascar?
Um, we we would have loved, that change could be guaranteed, but confidence should never be based on promises alone, but rather on institutions, transparency, and accountability. And Madagascar, once again, has a real opportunity to demonstrate that the transition can lead back to constitutional democratic rule, but that will require respecting the agreed timeline, ensuring broad participation of all stakeholders in the country, protecting also civic freedoms, because that's what was missing in the previous regime, and allowing independent institutions to do their work. And so far, the process has been delayed over and over again when we speak about the national dialogue, the consultations, and the situation increasing doubts about the real intentions of the military regime. Are they there to really make change or to try to keep the power? I think the international community should support the process, but ultimately, it's also Malagasy citizens who will determine its credibility. But if those Malagasy people are not involved into this very process, then we are already lacking a big piece of the puzzle.
Interestingly, the military has been engaging Russia quite a bit in terms of securing equipment and instructors, and this at a time that Madagascar remains suspended from the African Union. Um,
Yeah.
what do you see as the risks of the geopolitical, the foreign policy that Madagascar is taking at the moment? And what can the African Union do you think? I know that you believe that Malagasy people must do their own fighting and bidding, but you do need help, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, definitely. So, first thing to highlight is that, in my opinion, every sovereign nation has a right to diversify its international partnerships, right? But the real question for me is not really whether Madagascar cooperates with Russia, Europe, China, or others, but whether those partnerships strengthen national sovereignty, democratic institutions, and long-term development. And when we think about Russia, I'm not convinced that they can be a good partner in terms of democracy building, given their very own situation. So, in fragile political contexts, external actors can sometimes deepen geopolitical competition instead of supporting institutional reform. And Madagascar's guiding principle should always be transparency, national interest above everything else, accountability, regardless of who the partner is. regarding the African Union, I agree that, there should be some kind of collaboration in rebuilding this democratic trust and pathway for Madagascar, not in terms of ingerence, like getting deeply or influencing the decisions made in Madagascar, but bringing genuine and sincere interest and advice, technical advice, to strengthen the existing processes and also constantly monitoring the progress if you want, like putting this institutional pressure on the shoulders of the Malagasy government so that they deliver well. That role can be played by the African Union. There is, the ACDEC, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and Madagascar is party to it. This is a leverage that they can use, to make things maybe on the right track in Madagascar. So in that sense, on the technical side, I do agree there is something to do there. Yeah.
Madagascar sits on extraordinary mineral wealth, and that's something that a lot of African countries do have. But with the military government now in charge, who's likely to control those resources, and will citizens benefit?
That's a $1 billion question, Peter. Natural resources do not automatically generate development, and we all know that. They generate development only when they are governed transparently and in an accountable way. The real issue for us is not who signs the contracts, I guess. It's whether citizens benefit through fair taxation, environmental protection, value addition, local employment, and transparent public spending. If governance remains weak, mineral wealth risks enriching only a small elite, like it happened in the past, the very recent past. And if governance improves, those same resources could become a powerful engine for national development. So I would say, we are sitting at a crossroads. We all know that the energy transition will spring a rush for critical minerals, for instance, and we do have many of them here in Madagascar. But my feeling is that we are still lacking, this framework for making them beneficial for our own population. So this is a strong point of vigilance that we as civil society are closely monitoring, and we are relentlessly, providing some advice to the government on the way to make it right. So still hoping for things to work well on that side as well.
We're talking about Madagascar, but I want our viewers to know a little bit more about you, because I think your journey in many ways talks about the struggle of many Malagasys. And I want
Mm,
to start with this. I learned that Ketakandriana means little princess in your language.
exactly.
But your life really has been built almost as a warrior more than a princess. Take us back to that little girl, Tana, and reading Rousseau at the age of 14. What was going on in your mind? What was already burning inside you?
What burned inside me is just, this kind of revolt against injustice, because I saw so many of them happening in my own family. I grew up in a quite poor family, disadvantaged family, and my dad died when I was 11, and our mother raised us alone, me and my brother, and we were struggling, and that struggle was not isolated, because I was seeing really huge discrepancies and differences between the haves and have-nots, those who are very rich in our society and those who are deprivated. So that triggered something in me, and I started in a very young age to interrogate myself about the sources of such a difference, and it quickly, when I started my political science studies, I understood, that this is a kind of power asymmetry somewhere, that institutions are not delivering what they are supposed to do, but at the same time, that citizens are disempowered, if you want, because we are living in such a deep poverty. When you are hungry, when you have nothing, to feed your children, then you forget about politics, democracy, or whatsoever. These remain big words floating in the clouds. You just want to make a living. And I think our population is maintained voluntarily by a small elite in this state of perpetual poverty to impede any kind of intellectual or political development. But it's a state of fact that we are all aiming to break here, and the Gen Z revolts last year gave me somehow some hope because I was starting to think, yeah, maybe I'm not the only one, or the happy few who think that a better Madagascar is possible if the young people who are a majority in our country, they make 62% of our population, if they do realize that we deserve better, then change will be possible. Yeah.
So you finished top of the National Judiciary exams, you became a trainee judge, and then you walked away. And this is the first person in Madagascar's history to resign from that position. What were
Mhm.
you seeing on the inside that you couldn't live with? And is this something that still persists?
Mm, What I saw was corruption. Uh, when you become a judge, then what you want to do is the right thing, Law is not a complicated thing. You have a bill, you have just to deliver what is said there, right? And to rule accordingly. But what I was witnessing and felt also is that the executive power has a strong power of pressure over the judiciary. That means the separation of power is not real, is not effective in Madagascar, and that's the core heart of the problem, I would say. Um, and I could not live with that. I prefer to resist, from the outside, trying to change things from a civil society perspective, because if you are alone fighting against that system from the within, I don't know how long you can stand. That was just my kind of reasoning at the time. Very sadly, we already spoke about corruption previously. This state of things is still permanent and pervasive in Madagascar. This is still one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And I think the reason is that this small elite wants to really keep power. They know that corruption can be rewarding and they don't want to break it. It's all about state capture as well. This state capture is so entrenched in the Malagasy society that it's very hard to break. We tried, to learn some lessons from South Africa. Uh, you know that Prof. Tuli Madonsela has developed a full whole theory against state capture. So we learned some lessons from there, trying to domesticate them and to adjust and adapt to Madagascar. But I have to confess, it's really, really hard. I'm not saying it's desperate, but it will take longer than expected. But once again, this feeling that citizens are starting to wake up is something very interesting, and that opens a window of hope for ourselves for a more efficient change and victory against corruption someday.
And I call you a warrior because you've spent your career fighting this corruption, the impunity, the hollowing out of institutions, and you blew the whistle on the lychee trade and faced
Yeah.
prosecution for it. You've even received death threats, I believe. What does it take personally for you to keep going when the system will inevitably push back?
I mean, there are certainly moments when it is difficult, but I also understand that it is part of the game. When you engage in anti-corruption, you have to be ready to face those kinds of difficulties because you are touching on some people's interests. They don't want you to disturb their lives and their earnings. But I have also met countless courageous Malagasy citizens, investigative journalists, activists, community leaders, and ordinary people who continue to believe that integrity matters. what keeps me going is this deep conviction that corruption is not inevitable. It is created by systems, incentives, and choices. And if people created those systems, people can also change them, right? So public service and integrity are ultimately acts of hope for me, and the resistance has to keep going. Yeah, no surrender.
What do you teach your children? What do you say to them about what's going on in your country?
I have this habit of explaining things very bluntly to my four kids in their own words, but depicting our reality, but also entertaining some kind of hope. I want them to remain in the country, unlike many parents, whose dreams are just to send their children abroad because they are hoping for a better future. I'm not going to blame them for that, but I do believe that we have to remain here in Madagascar, repair and rebuild our own country. So that's just what I'm trying to tell them, like something better is still possible, but it takes a village to get there, and we have to build this village together. So each and every small act of resistance towards integrity, transparency, and accountability matters. And yeah, change is just around the corner. It depends on having the right strategy and also a more efficient mobilization. Numbers matter. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Ketakandriana, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Always good to hear your voice and your thoughts and your insights. And we wish you and your country the very best going forward.
Thank you so much, Peter. Take care and see you again. Bye bye.